Good afternoon. I think we're going to go ahead and get started with our programming today. I'm Tricia Gray. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department, and I want to welcome you all and thank you so much for coming out to hear our Grawemeyer winner today. This is what I like to call the Academy Awards of the Academy, and I think it's one of the most special and most important things that we do here at the university on a really national and global level. And I'm really excited about our winner today. But I'm not going to do that introduction. I'd like to introduce the director of the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas for Improving World Order, Dr. Chuck Ziegler, who has been here at the University of Louisville for 42 years. He probably didn't want me to say that, but he's been here for 42 years, and he's been the director of the Grawemeyer Award for the past 11, and a much longer member of the committee itself. So thank you so much, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ziegler.
So as Trish said, I've been here at the university for a long time, which means I am pretty darn old. But I'm still moving. I'm still doing the Grawemeyer Award. Been doing it for 11 years, and it's a wonderful thing. I'm going to tell you a bit about it. First, though, I want to introduce to you some of our honored guests. Number one, the members of the Grawemeyer family. If you would stand up or wave your arms right here. It was Charlie Grawemeyer, of course, who founded the World Order Award along with the others. Ours dates back to 1988, so it's the second oldest of the awards. Also, I'd like to recognize the Dean of Arts and Sciences, Dr. David Owen, there. The Executive Director of all 5 of the awards, Dr. Marianne Hambrick, way in the back. You've already met the chair of our department, Trish Gray, and also Roger Payne is here, I believe, right? Roger is a former director. He served 17 years in this capacity. So we're here to celebrate this book, Violence Against Women in Politics, and the ideas in it by Dr. Mona Lena Krook of Rutgers University. I'll put this right here. Let me tell you a bit about the Grawemeyer World Order Award first. It's given to those who've taken on issues of world importance and presented viewpoints that could lead to a more just and peaceful world. That was Charlie Grawemeyer's vision. Each idea supports a noble cause, and that is to inspire us all to work together for the common good, something that I think we don't do often enough in this world. The award's presented annually to a winner of a competition designed to stimulate recognition, dissemination, and critical analysis of outstanding proposals for improving world order. The Grawemeyer Award is accompanied, as all 5 are, by a cash prize of $100,000. It is, as far as we know, the largest award in the political science or international relations field, and that's presented at the award ceremony. The submissions that we get, and we get a lot of those every year, they're judged according to originality, feasibility, and potential impact, not by the cumulative record of the nominee. Although our winner this year certainly has an impressive cumulative record, as you'll see. So a little bit about the process by which winners are selected. Most people, including the winners, are often surprised by this. We get nominations in starting in January of a year. Then by February, we want them to have all the additional materials in, letters of support and books and so on. As faculty director for the award, I then send these out for peer review. So each book or article, and sometimes they are articles, will get sent out to at least 2 experts in the field. Top people who can review them from a position of real expertise. Then we get those reviews back in. The department committee, and there are a number of members here, members of the committee, wave your hands, I think most of them are back there. They are the faculty members in international relations, comparative politics, and so on. We meet together in May and we sift through all the evaluations of the award. We narrow it down to somewhere around 6 or 7 of the very best, and then we send those out to the distinguished international jury. Those are very top people in the field at places like Berkeley, Stanford, Cornell, Harvard, Yale, what have you, Toronto, University of Toronto, and other places. And they then, when we don't have a pandemic, come to Louisville in September, meet and narrow the field down to 3. And then there is a final selection committee. And Charlie Grawemeyer was very keen on this, that the award would go to a work which is readily understandable to an educated layperson. So we had the final presidential selection committee comprised of the Dean of Arts and Sciences, the Chair of Political Science, the President's representative, which is the executive director of the awards, and at least 3 people from the community, who may be a president of a bank, head of the NPR affiliate, head of a local charity or something like that, and they select the winner. The whole thing takes about a year. So this is a long and exhaustive process. So it's something to win this. All right. Now let me tell you a bit about our winner. Dr. Mona Lena Krook is professor of political science and chair of the Women in Politics PhD at Rutgers University. And she is the winner for her book, Violence Against Women in Politics. It's a very impressive work, and I will let her tell you about it. She's published widely on the issues of gender and political representation, particularly on electoral gender quotas and the impact of women in public affairs. Her first book, Quotas for Women in Politics, Gender and Candidate Selection Reform Worldwide, published by Oxford University Press, won the American Political Science Association's Victoria Shuck Award in 2010 for Best Book on Women and Politics. In 2019, it was further honored with a George H. Hallett Award for lasting contribution to the literature on representation and electoral systems. She's written a large number of articles in the very top political science journals, British Journal of Political Science, Comparative Political Studies, Comparative Politics, Political Research Quarterly, Politics and Gender, and many others. Her research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, and she's held a Rutgers University Chancellor's Scholarship. Since 2015, Dr. Krook has worked closely with colleagues at the National Democratic Institute and other global practitioners to recognize and combat violence against women in politics. Her book draws on her work with NDI to explore rising attacks against women in public life around the globe. In 2021, her work crossed the academic practitioner divide and was recognized as such by the Rutgers University Chancellor's Award for Global Impacts. She was named to Apolitical's 100 Most Influential People in Gender Policy list, honoring and celebrating people of all genders working on gender policy and making the world a more equitable place. She's won a number of other awards, but I would be here a long time if I went through all of those. Instead of doing that, I'll simply turn the floor over to her. Dr. Krook.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the invitation to University of Louisville and the opportunity to talk about my book, Violence Against Women in Politics. This research was initially inspired by work that I had previously done on electoral gender quotas, which are policies that have now been adopted in more than 140 countries around the world. That's mostly been since 1995, so it's a relatively recent phenomenon. And these are policies to get more women nominated as candidates and elected to political bodies around the world. So my first book really tried to understand how those policies diffused around the world and what impact they had on the numbers of women actually elected. My second big project emerged out of that work and tried to look at quotas beyond numbers, right? So think about what kinds of women were elected through quotas, what impact they had on policymaking, and what effects quotas and the increased presence of women in politics had on both women and democracy. So as I was doing fieldwork for the second project in 9 countries across Western Europe, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. I expected, amongst other things, to hear positive stories of transformation, right? Especially in terms of greater acceptance of women as leaders. And in the course of my interviews, I did hear those positive stories of transformation, but I also heard accounts of resistance and backlash, often taking the forms of violence, harassment, and intimidation. Around the same time, a number of practitioner organizations that I had been working with on gender quotas were also observing similar dynamics in their work on the ground to increase women's political participation. So that includes people like UN Women, the Interparliamentary Union, and the Inter-American Commission of Women. And in 2015, I connected with colleagues at the Gender, Women, and Democracy team at the National Democratic Institute, and we decided to collaborate to bring global attention to this issue. And in 2016, we launched the Not the Cost campaign to stop violence against women in politics, with a speech from NDI Chair Madeleine Albright and testimonies from political women around the world. So on the basis of these experiences, I decided to write a book that would be for both academics as well as practitioners, organized around 4 main questions. So first, where did this concept of violence against women in politics come from? How did political women around the world come to name their experiences in this way? Second, how is it different from other forms of violence in politics? And people often say that politics is a violent space, so perhaps it's not surprising that, as more women are entering these spaces, they also face violence. Third, what does violence against women in politics look like? What forms does it take around the world? And then finally, what can be done to address violence against women in politics, and why does it matter that we do? So in this talk, I'm going to give you my answers to all 4 of these questions. Before I start, though, I think it's probably a good idea just to clarify what I mean by the key terms, violence and women in politics. So for many people, violence refers to the use of physical force. So some scholars talk about this as a minimalist definition of violence, which privileges the perspective of the perpetrator and focuses on an act that takes place at a discrete moment in time, right? So with a clearly identifiable beginning and end. In contrast, more comprehensive definitions understand violence as a violation, and specifically a violation of integrity in the sense of the wholeness or intactness of the self. So from this perspective, a person's physical integrity can be violated, but also their mental and emotional integrity as well. And this approach shifts the focus to the targets and their experiences of violence, pointing out that violent acts can have ripple effects that affect the target as well as members of their families and their communities for years to come. And this is very much in line with how women's rights activists think about gender-based violence, right, in this more comprehensive way. And they argue that violence against women exists along a spectrum or a continuum of violence, where different kinds of acts tap into the same phenomenon, but also interact with and bolster one another. So the classic example is an iceberg, right, where the visible physical acts represent just the tip, and a large range of other acts, like gendered insults and sexual harassment, form a large mass under the surface. In terms of women in politics, my early work focused exclusively on female politicians. But my book argues that this phenomenon is about women's political participation more broadly. So we should be thinking about women serving in a wide range of political roles. And this is something that's already happening at the UN level, connecting parallel campaigns that have emerged during this time to tackle violence against female politicians, violence against women human rights defenders or activists, and violence against women journalists. But my definition also brings in women as voters, party members, election officials, and staffers and interns, among other possibilities. So it's a very wide definition of violence and a very wide definition of women in politics. Okay, so how did this concept emerge? Well, for a long time, like many of women's experiences, it was a problem with no name. Between 2000 and 2010, however, women in various parts of the global south began to talk about their experiences, alternatively as political harassment and violence against women in politics, and electoral gender-based violence. And although they used slightly different terms, they were trying to capture a form of violence that targeted women in politics because they are women. Right? So thinking about how do we capture this phenomenon that's not, that has lacked a concept or a term to describe. So around 2010 or so, a number of international organizations and NGOs working on democracy and electoral assistance began to connect these debates, pointing out that it wasn't a problem that just affected individual countries, but something that sort of crossed countries and crossed different regions of the world. But their initial focus, because of course they're democracy assistance organizations, really focused on this as a problem in the global south. Over the last 10 years, however, women across the global north have also started to speak up about this issue in countries like Australia, Italy, the UK, and the United States. The Me Too movement has also made it clear that sexual harassment is a problem in politics around the world. So, like violence against women in politics is a problem that affects women in a wide range of social, economic, and political contexts. Despite growing awareness of this problem, there's still ongoing barriers to speaking out. One is cognitive, where women normalize the violence against them, treating it as an individual issue rather than the structural problem that it is. Another barrier is political, where women hesitate to speak out because they fear it will make them look weak, or they think it could be weaponized for this reason by their political rivals. A third barrier relates to receptivity, where women do speak out, but then they're not believed, or they're accused of playing the gender card for talking about the violence. And a final barrier concerns resources, where women do want to speak out, but they have no place to go, right? Who would they talk to? Or they lack a language to describe their experiences. So my book really tries to help overcome these barriers in various ways. It really tries to think about how women on the ground have defined this problem and trying to bring some academic tools to understand and develop a more robust definition of this issue. So I would think that one of the ways that I try to address this is through the theoretical framework in my book, which seeks to distinguish between what I call violence in politics and violence against women in politics. So violence in politics is how political violence has traditionally been understood, right, as being directed at political opponents. So in this sense, it's issue-based. It's about implementing your policy vision rather than the other side's. It's a form of violence that affects both men and women. It tends to be higher in contexts where there's greater impunity for violence. So conflict and post-conflict context, but also in places where state capacity to enforce the law is relatively low. This form of violence can take some gender-differentiated forms, for example, with the use of sexual violence against female supporters of another party. And the democratic cost of this type of violence are well recognized because one side gets its way through force and intimidation rather than through fair democratic elections. Violence against women in politics, in contrast, is identity-based. It specifically targets women driven by patriarchal imperatives, and namely the idea that politics is a male space, and women therefore must be kept out. It can take some gender-differentiated forms like sexual violence, but also some non-gendered forms like assassinations. The democratic cost of this form of violence, I argue, are not yet widely recognized. And I think this is for a few reasons. First, patterns of violence against women are highly normalized in many societies. So these acts don't really seem like they're out of the ordinary, right? So they don't attract a lot of attention. Second, there's often a tendency to equate acts of violence against women in politics with sort of ordinary violence in politics. And so as a result, acts that are identity-based are framed as instead being issue-based. Finally, most politically active women experience both forms of violence, sometimes at different points in time and sometimes at the same time. But I argue that it's vital to recognize these two dimensions, even if they're sometimes difficult to disentangle in practice. And this is because violence against women in politics poses a distinct but equally important challenge to democracy and human rights. Data from a UN Women's Study of violence against politically active women in India, Pakistan, and Nepal provide some evidence for this distinction. So when people were asked who perpetrates violence against women in politics, and you'll see that the largest share of perpetrators in India were identified as being the other contestant. But if you look across the three countries, the two most common perpetrators were members of women's own political parties and members of their own families. These findings are surprising if we only understand political violence as being issue-based. But they're not surprising if we draw on insights from work on gender-based violence, which shows that women are most likely to experience violence at the hands of people they know. Talking about violence against women in politics, of course, doesn't necessarily mean that gender is the only salient identity. In my interviews and in the emerging research in this area, we see that younger women, women of color, seem to face even higher levels of abuse. But this is, again, not surprising because the violence against women in politics framework suggests that women are attacked because they're not seen as rightful participants in political spaces. Right, so this is an insight that should hold as well for people who challenge the status quo in other ways, right? People who don't look like the typical older white male politician. So all of this is to say that not all forms of violence faced by politically active women are cases of violence against women in politics. What really matters is the motive rather than the specific target. Okay, so then turning to what this violence looks like in practice, most practitioners focus on 4 types of violence, which are widely recognized in international conventions and national legislation on violence against women. And these 4 types are physical, sexual, psychological, and economic violence. So this is the findings of the first global study of this question. I participated in it. It's done by the Interparliamentary Union, which is a global organization of parliaments. So they administered this survey amongst women in parliament from all corners of the world, all types of backgrounds. And I think that these results really show the importance of recognizing the broader spectrum of violence. So you can see around 25% of women in the study reported they'd experienced physical violence in the course of their work in parliament. So just as part of their political work, right? Not just like as a woman in society, just specific to their political work. So about 1 in 4 reported having experienced physical violence. But more than 80% said they'd experienced some form of psychological violence. Around 1/3 had experienced economic violence, and around 20%, and I think that's an underestimation, this is before the Me Too movement, had experienced sexual violence. And so if we only focus on the physical forms, we don't really capture what women are actually experiencing on the ground, and especially the widespread nature of psychological abuse. So in my book, I go on to give examples of these 4 types of violence, using examples from both the global north and the global south. Physical violence, I think most intuitive to understand, so it would include things like murders or kidnappings, beatings, also false imprisonment, which is a special issue for women human rights defenders. Psychological abuse typically involves death and rape threats, intimidation, and stalking. But perhaps the most common form is online harassment, so on social media platforms. Very common experience for politically active women around the world. Sexual violence can include things like rape, sexual harassment, and sexualized threats. And as I said, it's traditionally been the one form of violence that's really been the most difficult. On a very difficult topic, it's been the most difficult type of violence for women to speak up about, although the Me Too movement, I think, has really made this easier in recent years. Economic violence, this is maybe a concept that you're less familiar with. It refers to using access to economic resources as a form of intimidation or coercion. So in this context, it can involve destroying women's campaign materials, vandalizing their offices and their homes, and ruining their livelihoods, making it difficult or impossible to continue their political work. To these standard 4 types, I add a 5th category that I call semiotic violence, which I suggest is not captured by the existing typologies. It involves using words and images to degrade and delegitimize women as political leaders, primarily for a larger public. So this would include things like photoshopped images depicting women in sexually graphic and humiliating ways, photos of women without headscarves posted in mosques to suggest that they're immoral, false sex tapes released during elections, and deep fake videos portraying women in false and misleading ways. And semiotic violence is something I think has characterized portrayals of women in public life throughout history, but it's really gained new life with rising gender disinformation campaigns, or the fake news about women leaders. This is the primary tactic. We see this in many different contexts around the world. Okay, so then, given this widespread problem, what can we do? So in my book, I try to give a wide range of examples of solutions that try to tackle individual forms of violence, as well as solutions trying to tackle multiple forms of violence at the same time. So the starting point for any strategy, and I kept coming back to this in every chapter, is awareness raising. And so I would put the Not the Cost campaign into this category. And our slogan was inspired by suggestions that violence is simply the cost of doing politics for women, right? The price that women have to pay for being politically engaged. So we wanted to shift the perspective by insisting that violence should not be the cost of women's political participation, right? Sort of denormalizing it, right? Calling it what it is. But we also see many different efforts. We see group letters published in prominent newspapers. We see individual women going out and giving talks, publishing books about their experiences. So really at all different levels. In the United States, women in Congress have really been at the forefront of bringing attention to this issue, although it's an issue in local politics, state politics, and federal politics. Women in Congress have really, over the last 2 years, tried to bring growing attention to this issue, using floor speeches, special sessions, open letters to different types of actors, and most recently 2 House resolutions, one in 2020, which is one I've posted here, and another in 2021, trying to raise awareness of violence against women in politics as a global problem, including in the United States, and calling for government action on this issue. When we look at individual forms of violence, we look at physical violence. We've seen efforts in countries like Nigeria and Afghanistan to develop virtual campaigning tools so that women can reach voters without exposing them to security threats, right? And some of these, this particular app, Votes, also helps women raise money for their campaigns in a virtual sort of way. In the UK, we also saw Parliament set up a new security office in the wake of the murder of Jo Cox, who was a member of Parliament in 2016. She was killed 1 week before the Brexit referendum. And so it led to a lot of awareness of violence against politicians in the UK, but specifically women and people of color as well in British politics. So this is a way to try to anticipate those violent threats. In terms of psychological abuse, one of my favorite examples is a Canadian NGO that's developed ParityBot, which tries to detect online abuse against women during elections, and it responds with positive and encouraging messages, right? So like you don't have a feed that's completely negative and insulting and bringing you down. but something that says keep going. You know, it's really important that women are part of the discussion. We also see some individual female politicians. I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a very good example, who uses her social media platform to try to speak back to the abusive messages that she faces both on and offline. A third strategy, and I think this is really, you see this amongst activists, it's just self-care, right? Just thinking about ways to relieve stress and focus on things that you enjoy to really get your energy back up to fight another day. Sexual violence, this was has emerged since the Me Too movement. And you've seen both of my examples refer to the Me Too movement in different ways. So we see a number of countries' efforts to collect women's testimonies to help connect them to resources, as well as to help inform party policies on sexual violence and harassment. So on the left, you see an example from the British Labour Party. We've also seen initiatives in Canada and in the European Parliament to try to create pledges and codes of conduct to try to denormalize harassment and abuse, to really shift the culture around violence. In terms of economic violence, the main efforts here have been to try to provide rapid response grants to activists facing urgent security concerns. Finally, in terms of semiotic violence, some of the strategies have simply been to try to use existing laws to gain accountability for perpetrators. For example, using laws on hate speech or laws on threats or intimidation, which is often illegal. We also see efforts to try to rethink the language of politics in more inclusive and egalitarian directions. And on the right, this is a guide produced by the Chamber of Deputies in Argentina to try to sort of shift the political culture in this more egalitarian way. This is really an area where I think semiotic violence is perhaps the most widespread form of violence against women in politics. And so I think that there's a lot of space here to develop future interventions, especially given powerful intersections with gender disinformation campaigns. In terms of cross-cutting solutions, we are seeing growing efforts at both the global and state levels to develop international frameworks as well as national legislation on this issue. So the UN's been very active in this regard, and many countries in Latin America have seen laws proposed and passed to criminalize violence against women in politics. And the first country to pass a law like this was Bolivia in 2012. And that has really served as a model for many other countries to develop similar legislation. Most recently, Mexico passed a law on this issue. At the civil society level, there have also been efforts to support safety planning for women's political campaigns. So this is included in places like Kenya, a text messaging hotline to report acts of violence that are reported to police, but then also supplemented by follow-up support with legal advice and referrals for medical care and counseling. Okay, so finally, why does it matter that we address violence against women in politics? So in the book, I argue that violence against women in politics doesn't just affect the individual targets. Even if that was true, like if that's the only thing it did, that's still important. But I think that we also need to recognize that it has really big implications for political institutions and society more broadly. So it has at least 3 effects on democracy. It undermines, first off, the exercise of women's political rights, from the right to vote to the right to run for and hold office, to the right of free expression. It also attempts to interrupt women's political work, drawing time and attention away from their political priorities, and in many cases leading them to self-censor when it comes to speaking out about important topics. And finally, it negatively affects citizens' levels of trust in politicians and the political process more generally. So undercutting civility and mutual respect of political opponents adds value in democratic politics. Violence against women in politics also infringes on women's human rights. This is because, above all, it seems to attack women's personal dignity and integrity, undermining their feelings of self-worth. Politically active women in various parts of the world have shared that, in the words of one Kenyan politician, My attackers had wanted to humiliate me, strip me of all my dignity, and leave of me but a shell. Abuse also threatens individual sense of security, right, limiting women's freedom of movement, and cultivating a sense of constant external awareness that may sort of thwart their pursuit of social justice due to an increased sense of the cost of that activism. And lastly, violence against women in politics affects gender equality. Violence against women, more broadly, is widely recognized as a form of discrimination against women. In politics, it has both individual and group effects. So many places around the world, it has caused politically active women to leave politics or to very seriously consider leaving politics, or to modify their behaviors, reducing the impact of their voices and participation in political debates. Their mistreatment has also served as a warning to other women to not follow their lead, or in some cases even just to express support for women in public life. And one of the biggest emerging concerns in this area is how violence might affect the political ambitions of young women, affecting not just the present, but also the future of gender equality in politics. So naming the problem of violence against women in politics, therefore, has important repercussions along multiple dimensions, making the defense of women's rights integral to the protection of the political and human rights of everyone. While it is a large and seemingly intractable problem, the good news is that everyone can do something to address it. And perhaps the most important thing being to name the problem and to call it out. And because this is a rapidly developing topic, my book really tries to start a conversation rather than provide the final word. So with this in mind, I created a couple of companion resources to my book that could capture these new developments. It's a Twitter account and a website with all the latest news and research on violence against women in politics. So from academics, but also from different practitioner organizations, policy makers around the world. So I encourage you to check them out if you're interested in being part of the solution as well. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Crook will take questions now, and I'll come around with a microphone so we can keep this on the recording. Who would like to start out today? Don't be shy.
How do the men in your life feel about your book?
Well, the main man in my life is right here, my husband. He's my biggest booster, my biggest supporter. I also have 2 young sons to whom I've dedicated the book and who will be getting the benefits of my Grawemeyer funds so they can also create the positive change.
Could you speak a little bit about how you see the different forms of violence that you identified? What global variations, or in terms of looking at kind of regions of the world, you referenced how, we see certain things in the global South, and you sort of mentioned North America. Are these, are each of those forms, comparable in different places, or are there places where certain types of violence are more prevalent?
Personally, the area of the world where I first learned about this issue was in Mexico. And you might know that most recent Mexican elections have been the most physically violent ever in Mexican history, in a country where there's a lot of physical violence. And so I think when I was originally thinking about this issue, I was often thinking about, maybe physical forms more common, maybe in the global South or in conflict context. But as I was thinking about this, then Joe Cox was murdered, right? So British member of Parliament, you might know a second member of the British Parliament was also killed last year, just in front of his, local district office. So I started to realize that actually maybe it wasn't productive to try to think about patterns that were more common in parts of the world, because we know that violence against women is a problem that affects women in all countries, all backgrounds, right? Every kind of age, ethnic group. And so I thought, I don't want to like foreclose missing, for example, online abuse in Mexican politics, which one of my PhD students really recently finished her dissertation, and she studies online abuse in Mexican politics. So like clearly that's an issue, even if maybe it's more common in contexts like Australia or France, for example. And so I really made an effort across all of the chapters to think about what are some examples I can give from different regions and from the global north and global south. So we have examples in every chapter on physical, psychological, sexual, et cetera, that really tries to show that this is a problem that really affects women in many different contexts around the world. Thank you.
Great, and maybe I can ask also a question about variation. It's a good follow-up to that. I was curious if how you're thinking about change over time in some of the patterns that you observe. Obviously, this is a problem that we see more of now, right? Mm-hmm. You seem to have some suspicion about whether there actually is more of it now,
right,
or whether we're just seeing it. But how do you and the folks who you're working with on this project think about whether what the sort of secular trends are over time?
Yeah, I think this is a really big question, right? So first I would say that this is such a new area of research that there are so many questions that could still be asked. And I would say that this is probably the largest growing area of research on gender and politics, right? So many graduate students, young people just starting out in their PhD studies, really interested in studying this question. So I think we're going to know a lot more about this, in the next 5 to 10 years. And so I would say that there are a lot of questions like variations over time, in individual countries, across countries that we will, get to know more about. But I really struggled with this idea of like, are these rising attacks or just more visible attacks, right? So in the book I say, there's a few things that could be going on. So we know from the work on gender quotas that there are more women in political life now than ever before in our history. This is like in every country around the world, including in the United States. More diverse women, right? Young women, women of color, members of the LGBTQ community, right? Like we're really diversifying our political spaces. So is it a backlash against diversification? And I think that's part of it. You can see that in the specific types of attacks. At the same time, this moment has led veteran female politicians to speak up about the abuse that they've been facing, right? So women are like in the 60s, in the 70s, and I think to me one of the most surprising ones was in 2016, the former Minister of Women's Affairs in France, there was sort of a Me Too movement there without sexual harassment of the vice president of the French Parliament, and she said, the people are speaking up about this, bravo. When I was Minister of Women in the 1970s, I was sexually assaulted by a senator, and shame on me for not speaking out, right? And so, like, you have the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada say, in the 70s, I was raped by one of my colleagues in the provincial legislature, right? So clearly, these women have been experiencing this violence for a very long time. I also got very interested in women's suffrage movements, and both in the US and the UK, suffragettes experienced a huge range of violence, including like during public marches, they were physically, sexually assaulted. And this includes in Washington, D.C., right on Pennsylvania Avenue on the way to the White House. So I realized that actually this is something that really has characterized women's fight for their political rights for a very long time. But I also think that the present moment has really created opportunities to perpetrate this violence. The increased political polarization we see in the US and elsewhere. Social media technologies makes it super easy, right, to reach women like on their phones, right, in their pockets, inside their homes, right, not just on their email accounts or in their places of work. And so there are more ways to perpetrate those attacks, right? So more tools available. And so maybe that's something that makes it feel like it's on the rise too, because it's a much wider experience. So I think the overtime question is very difficult, but I think that it really highlights, the structural nature of the challenge that women's increased presence poses, right, to the existing political system in all parts of the world.
Thank you so much for this work. It's so important and vibrant, so I'm so thankful to have you here. I just want to drill down, linking with the last two questioners, about the current situation in the U.S. And again, as the last questioner named, it appears that there is more of the different forms of violence against women in politics in the U.S. with the political polarization. But again, I'm not sure if it appears that way, if people are speaking out more, if we just have more media tools. Wondering if you have any sense about this nation.
Yeah, so my impression is that I think that the discussion started to turn in 2016, but I think 2018 is really, I think, the beginning. So 2018 was a year where more diverse groups of women ran for office, like unprecedented numbers in local politics, state politics, in both houses of Congress. And so I think it somehow became more visible as part of this discussion. Also, following the 2020 elections, I had so many interviews with journalists because of attacks on women secretaries of state, right? As well as the COVID pandemic. There's some interesting research showing that women public health officials, especially women of color public health officials, have received incredible amounts of death threats for mask mandates, right? We also saw last week was the conclusion of the trial, the kidnapping conspiracy against Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, right? Where they were going to not just kidnap her, but also try to publicly execute her on public television, right? So I think American politics is really full of this, but there's also, I think, very much a hunger for women to speak up about it. But it's interesting because one of the journalists I talked to, he was trying to get this article published for about 6 months. And his editor kept saying, is this really a story? Like all the the death threats against Katie Hobbs, Secretary of State, people camping out at her son's school and calling her husband's work, right? And they were like, well, but she's a public official. She should just expect that. And I think, well, okay, I don't think so. Like there is a line where that's not correct, but also that it's the women governors and the women public health officials and the women secretaries of state who seem to be particularly attracting this vitriol. And the reason why I say it's identity-based is that obviously some of these are partisan differences, but I think it's also the ways that women get attacked. So you look at the Gretchen Whitmer, the evidence, it's like using gendered slurs, right? And who does she think she is being, telling us what to do? This is all about this woman, why is she here? She's not legitimate because she's a woman, right? And so I think there's obviously that partisan element to it, but very much a gendered element about who can and can't participate in our public life.
I had a question on, you had on your PowerPoint the percentages with younger women in politics and older women in politics, and I was wondering if you thought that younger women in politics, or if you had any speculation as to whether they reported more violence because they experienced more violence, or if older women are just less likely to report or more desensitized.
I think there are a few reasons, few possibilities. So when I helped the Interparliamentary Union on their first global study, the veteran women that I talked to were really in denial about the problem as a problem for themselves. They're like, well, nobody would attack me, but my young female colleagues, oh my God, right? They're really the focus of sexual harassment, or they're the ones who are really questioned. But then I realized that, there's a little bit of that, not just the cognitive, but also that political gap that I talk about, is that I think they may experience it too. And this is why, in that study, there was a question, did you personally experience it, or did you see one of your female colleagues experience it? And that's a classic way of doing research on gender-based violence, because it's hard to admit that you're a victim of violence. So you'll say, oh, does your neighbor or your friend experience it? And then even if they didn't, you sort of put your experience in their category, right? So I think that there may be some underreporting amongst older women. But I think there are also good reasons why younger women might face more attacks. So one is because they challenge the political status quo in two ways, right? There aren't a lot of young people in politics, right? And so they're sort of challenging in multiple ways. And I think somebody like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a classic example. She's the youngest member of U.S. House of Representatives. She's Latina. She's from, she's a bartender, so she has a lower socioeconomic background, right? So she challenges a lot of the traditional ideas about who we think should be a leader, right, or in public life. But I also think, in addition to that, is the fact that younger people are more likely to be online, right, interacting with people on social media. So I think that if social media is a primary arena for this kind of attack, people know that that woman's online, she's seeing my tweets, right? And so I think there's also that element too, the accessibility to commit those kinds of acts as well.
In your research regarding countries with gender quotas, have you noticed any differences in the amounts of violence and the types of violence towards women in countries with gender quotas and countries without?
I think that's a wonderful question, especially if I go back to the case of Bolivia, which I mentioned was in 2012 passed a law on violence against women in politics. So this is a country where they introduced a 30% gender quota in the late 1990s. And rather than nominating 30% women, parties committed massive electoral fraud by feminizing the male names on their list. So like Julio was listed as Julia, you know, so like they were trying to find ways to like accidentally on purpose misspell their candidate names. And then there was like legislation passed that you can't do this, and you know, so et cetera. And then you have you know, the increase of the quota later to 50%. And it wasn't just for national politics, but also for local politics, including in very rural areas, you know, areas with very strong indigenous communities, right, which had more traditional ideas about gender. And so it was really those locally elected women, especially from rural and indigenous areas, that started to name this problem, right? And so the reason why they've gotten to those positions was because of the quotas, right? And so what really seemed to happen was that before women were excluded, now the quotas required women to be included, so you include women, but then you make it so miserable for them that they leave, right? Or that they're just not effective, or you character assassinate them so it's impossible for them to continue in their communities. And so I think there's a very intimate relationship between gender quotas and violence against women in politics. And I think it's not a surprise that Latin America is the region of the world that has made most progress in women's political representation in the last 25 years. It leads all other regions in terms of the share of women in their parliament. Almost all of those countries have a gender quota law, 30%, 40%, 50%, and multiple countries have passed laws on violence against women in politics. So I think these are all intertwined developments.
I also had a question about gender quotas and your observations surrounding them. What type of women do you typically see elected by gender quotas in terms of race, religion, sexuality, political ideology, et cetera?
This is part of my ongoing project, so thank you for expressing interest in this question. So I've been doing research in different parts of the world. I also do like consulting in other additional parts of the world. And so I think there's no like pat answer to this question, but I would say that I've observed that it contributes to diversity in politics, so not just women, but we see a lot more younger women getting elected, ethnic minority women being elected. When quotas require all parties to have female candidates, it means we also get ideological diversity amongst the women who are elected. If you contrast to a non-quota country like the United States, the Democratic Party elects so many more women than the Republican Party. So we don't get the ideological diversity, right, of women in public life. I would also say one of the topics I've studied very closely is the question of merit, right? Because that's often the argument against quotas is like brings in unqualified people who wouldn't have gotten in there otherwise. We actually see that the women coming in through quotas are equally or more highly educated than the men. They are equally or more diligent legislators, more likely to show up to sessions, more likely to ask questions, propose legislation, right? So they actually, what we see it really is that it contributes both in terms of diversity and the quality of politics. Sure.
A question about the world of practitioners and programming. I wonder if this work that you've done, do you see a point when incorporating discussions about violence against women in politics, providing women with resources, is that going to be incorporated into candidate recruitment and candidate training and civic and political party initiatives to bring more women into politics? I've spent time supporting initiatives in the past to encourage women to participate, but then we also wonder, are we making women more vulnerable, and is this going to become sort of part of incorporated into resources that are provided for women sort of from the beginning? Do you see that coming about?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, and sometimes people have asked me, is it not maybe counterproductive to talk about violence against women in politics because it will turn more women off to politics, right? Especially young women. But I actually think that it's so important to talk about this, because if women then go off to run for office and they get all these online abuse or scary emails or phone calls, or people approaching them in the streets, and they think it's a me problem, right? It's not a we problem, right? And I think I have sat on panels with female politicians. I have talked to them, like women crying, just like remembering their experiences. I think we need to prepare women, right? Like this is going to happen, and it's not just going to be like because you're a person in public life, but because you're a woman, and people are going to attack you in very personalized ways. That means you can be prepared for that, right? It's like psychologically brace yourself. But I've seen a number of candidate training programs now include things like how to be safer online, right? How do you deal with online attacks? Like, do you delete? Do you block? Do you report? Right? How do you have sort of a healthier online life, right? It also means that if you do need to take precautions like don't publish your address, right? Or, just, the transportation you take, like all these things are just easy things you can just sort of adjust to make yourself safer. And I think we're seeing more of that in the international programming on this issue, as well as in some of at Rutgers, we have training programs for women in politics, where they also include this in terms of your digital, campaign strategies and things like that.
Okay, any other questions? While you're thinking about it, I will go ahead and ask one. Fascinating presentation, really wonderful. It got me thinking, though, about some of the other questions, too, related to the current, what seems to be global upsurge in populism.
Yeah.
And Marine Le Pen accepted. Many of the populist movements are male-dominated, macho. And do you see this as a growing problem for those populist movements, whether they're India, here, Hungary, Poland, Brazil, to generate more violence against women in politics?
Definitely. So, we see populist movements are often, in most cases, right, led by, say, charismatic male leaders who really focus on their macho style. I mean, Vladimir Putin is also just all about trying to perform his masculinity, right? It's very they're very nervous about not showing that they're man enough, right? And so I think that that's true, I think, of all leaders, but I think for populist leaders, that sort of manliness, macho-ness is exceedingly important. And it's very much tied up with their idea about who can be a leader, right? And so we see that there's a lot of, especially hostility to female opponents. And I think the case you can see this in is in Brazil in 2016, the first female president was impeached on very questionable grounds. And the man who is now the president, he had dedicated his vote to her impeachment to the generals during the military dictatorship who tortured her when she was a student activist. Right? So it's not, any sort of, shying away from projecting physical violence, saying that she doesn't deserve to be the president of Brazil because she's not a man, right? Very sexualized, bumper stickers, really, very sexist language that you heard on the floor of the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. And it's very much part of Bolsonaro's strategy, right, to really highlight his masculinity. You also see that populist movements around the world have also been big proponents of anti-gender movements, which are trying to sort of turn back the tide in terms of gains on women's rights and gender equality, LGBTQ rights around the world. And so, Bolsonaro in Brazil, has passed all sorts of laws, getting rid of all of the gender equality legislation of his predecessors, having all these anti-gay types of bills passed as well. So it's very much tied both in terms of the people, but also the policies of populist movements.
Other questions? Anyone?
So in talking about ways to address violence against women, are there any initiatives to educate like young men and boys about this problem and sort of teach them about how to like respect women in politics?
I don't know about like a specific program, but I think that there's a lot of, work trying sort of trainings that are being developed that aren't just about training women candidates, but also trying to promote gender equality values in politics. So my colleagues at the National Democratic Institute created like a whole training for men in political parties to think about gender equality, like their own gendered identities. And it's really about like trying to raise awareness and sort of shift their mindsets about gender equality, not just in politics, but like in all areas of life. This is why I think it's really important that this is an issue that should just be directed at women, right? I think we need to talk about this amongst men in our communities as well. I should also just highlight that and I think this gets back to the early question about the men in my life, is that it's not just men who are perpetrating violence against women in politics, it's actually other women as well. Right, so we think about the United States, somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene is constantly waging attacks against some of her Democratic female colleagues of color, right? And so, even her campaign materials, this picture of her with a machine gun pointed at, the first Muslim women elected to the US Congress, right? It's not like metaphorical, right? It's something that can raise the levels of danger experienced by our elected representatives. So women can also perpetrate this, and so I think that's another reason to make sure both men and women, we can talk about this to both those groups.
Okay, other questions? Anyone? Going once, going twice? Okay, let's thank Dr. Crook for a wonderful presentation.
Thank